do with that. So hopefully we might start a little bit grim, but we're going to end up in hope. And I think there's actually some good helpful stuff for us in there. But before I get to unpacking some of those readings a little bit, I want to follow or continue Tracy's habit of giving you a book recommendation. And I'm actually going to bookend the sermon with some quotes from this book. Some of you may have read it. It's called Being the Bad Guys. The subtitle is How to Live for Jesus in a World That Says You Shouldn't, by a guy called Stephen McAlpine. If you like to kind of watch cultural trends and think about what it means to be a Christian in the culture, it's a great book. I don't subscribe to everything that he says. He's pretty combative, and I'll say a bit more about that later. But he's an excellent gives an excellent critique of culture, and it's well worth a read. I'll just read a little bit of the introduction to set the scene for us for today's sermon. He starts a bit like this. Only a few generations ago, Christianity was the good guy, the solution to what was bad. Rather than being on the wrong side of the law, we were the law. Christian morality was assumed and passed mainly unchallenged. The cultural, legal and political power structures affirmed Christians. Then something changed. Over the course of the 20th century, we became just one of the guys. One option among many, a voice to be considered but not to be followed unquestioningly. If Christianity worked for you, fine. If it didn't work for me, also fine. But the problem is that's not where we are now. The tide has shifted even further, he says. Increasingly, Christianity is viewed as the bad guy. Christianity is no longer an option. It's a problem. The cultural, political and legal guns that Christianity once held are now trained on us. And it's happened quickly. I think our next slide gives an image of how Christians are viewed today. It's not a great picture, but he's not the only one painting this picture. Another writer, Aaron Wren, maps change into three stages. He's talking into an American context, but I think the same is mirrored in Australia and other Western democracies. And he divides it up into sort of these three stages. Our next slide is going to help us out with Homer, and you'll identify each of the stages through the Simpsons lens here. But Aaron Wren says, pre-1994, which I grant you is a long period of time, we lived in the positive world. Society at large, he says, retains mostly a positive view of Christianity. To be known as a good church-going man remains part of being an upstanding citizen. Publicly being a Christian is a status enhancer. Christian moral norms are the basic moral norms of society, and violating them can bring negative consequences. So that's the positive world. That was pre-1994. Now, we'll comment on our view of history in a moment. But then he suggests that we moved from the positive world to the neutral world. And he says this is sort of 1994 to about 2014 or thereabouts, where society takes a neutral stance towards Christianity. Christianity no longer has a privileged status, but it's not disfavoured. Being publicly known as a Christian has neither a positive nor a negative impact on your social status. Christianity is a valid option within a pluralistic public square, and Christian moral norms retain some residual effect. But then we move from 2014 into the present, and we move into the negative world. Society has come to have a negative view of Christianity. Being known as a Christian is a social negative, particularly in the elite domains of society. Christian morality is expressly repudiated and seen as a threat to the public good and the new public moral order. Subscribing to Christian moral views or violating the secular moral order brings negative consequences. Not a really cheery view of the world for us, but we hear that sort of commentary and we perhaps experience it. Now, he talks about pre-1994 as being the positive stage. I'm not sure that it came as quite that much of a surprise. If you go back a little bit to C.S. Lewis's observations in 1954, so I think he saw something coming. This is part of a speech, the inaugural lecture lecture from the Chair of Medieval and Renaissance Literature at Cambridge University, which was a seat that C.S. Lewis held for a time. And he said this. It's a little bit long, being C.S. Lewis, though you need the full kind of impact. Of course, he says, the unchristening of Europe in our time is not quite complete. Neither was her christening in the Dark Ages. But roughly speaking, we may say that whereas all history was for our ancestors divided into two periods, the pre-Christian and the Christian, and two only, for us it falls into three, the pre-Christian, the Christian, and what may reasonably be called the post-Christian. This surely must make a momentous difference. Lewis goes on to say, I'm not here considering either the christening or the unchristening from a theological point of view. I'm considering them simply as cultural changes. When I do that, it appears to me that the second change is even more radical than the first. Christians and pagans had much more in common with each other than either has with a post-Christian. The gap between those who worship different gods is not so wide as that between those who worship and those who do not. 1954, I think C.S. Lewis saw what was coming and read it well. But that's all kind of big picture societal observation. But what does that feel like for us day to day? What does it feel like for the average Christian in Australia? How do we feel the impact of being the bad guys? Well, here's some things that we might point to, and you'll see a summary of them on the next slide. Perhaps we might point to the 2022 court case involving Wansley, a foster care agency in Western Australia, where a married couple who were members of the Free Reformed Christian Church were allegedly denied an adoption because of their religion. Or maybe we might point to the experience of Andrew Thorburn at Essendon Football Club, forced to resign as CEO after only one day because someone else realised that he had another role as chairman of City on a Hill Church. Or maybe we'll point to the Victorian Liberal Party election candidate banned from the party room because of her so-called extreme Christian views on gender and abortion. Or maybe we might point to the public condemnation and pile-on of sporting stars like Margaret Court and Israel Folau. Lots of things we can draw on, but again, they're all kind of out there. What about our day-to-day experience? Well, let me give you a few samples of my school experience that might point to this experience of being the bad guys. One of my, I can't say favourite because it's not a nice kind of incident, but one that sort of struck me as, oh, well, this is the world we're living in, was every year we have the Gideons come in and give a gift of a Bible to our Year 7s. It's a lovely little tradition that we have, and the Year 7s are encouraged to take it home. They don't have to take a Bible, but if they want one, they're welcome to take it, and most do. And I was chatting with one student who informed me that he took his Bible home and showed his parents, and his father took the Bible and said, we don't have that sort of thing in this house, and threw it in the fire. And I wondered why they were going to an Anglican school, but that sort of thing was, then the student was telling me, like, well, that's just the way it is. I could tell you about some emails I've had from parents. I won't, but I could tell you about some emails I've had from parents complaining about Christian studies or some of the religious components of the school, often in very aggressive and rude ways. Or I could tell you about the open antagonism of students in Christian studies. We feel it around us in the environment that we're in. If any of you listen to stand-up comedy at all, and it's a bit of a seasonal thing, but I don't mind a bit of stand-up comedy, and you might have noticed that Christians are often the butt of the stand-up comedians' jokes. I made the fatal mistake. It was a foolish thing to do, but I jumped online to look for anti-Christian jokes, and that was a hideous experience. And I cannot share 99% of the jokes I found with you, and I do not want to. I did find one that it still leaves you feeling a bit blah, but at least it's not yuck. And I don't expect uproarious laughter. It's a kind of a funny joke, but as Christians, it will leave us feeling a little bit, well, you'll see. Let me tell you the joke anyway, because it's not too horrible. It goes like this. A preacher, and you know it's going to be good when the preacher's the subject of it. A preacher was taking a walk one day and happened upon a young girl who was playing with something in a cardboard box. When he got closer, he could see that the box held a litter of newborn kittens. Well, what kind of kittens are those? Asked the preacher. They're Christian kittens, replied the little girl. Well, the preacher walked on, very pleased that the little girl had Jesus foremost in her thoughts. few days later, the preacher saw the little girl again. "How are your little Christian kittens doing today?" he asked. "Oh, they aren't Christian kittens, they're atheist kittens," replies the girl. "But I thought you said they were Christian kittens," responded the preacher, concerned over the sudden change. "Oh, they were, but now their eyes are open." Now, just take a snapshot of that feeling that you just had. I know it's not a nice one, don't hold on to it, but just note it. Just note it. Because that kind of captures the mood that I want to speak into. I don't want to dwell in it, but I want to speak into that mood. Because being a Christian is not exactly the height of fashion right now. So the question then is, well, if that's the case, how are we to respond as Christians? How should we respond, and how are we responding when that's the tone of the conversation? And I want to suggest this morning 3 postures, 3 responses that we might take, 2 of which we often take but are unhelpful, and one of which I think is more what Jesus asks of us. Now, before I jump into those 3 postures, I should also give 2 other cautionary notes, and I've already illustrated them. The first is this, and I think these are on our next slide. Beware confirmation bias. Now, how did I gather that list of examples of anti-Christian sentiment? Well, I went looking for them, didn't I? Which is a silly thing to do, but for my purposes, I went looking for them, and of course I could find them. Of course I could gather lots of examples. When we feel like we're being victimised as the bad guys, it's very easy to fall into the trap of feeding on these sorts of incidents to fuel our sense of injustice or victimhood. I told you some grim little sort of experiences from school. I could tell you 101 wonderful positive experiences too. So we need to be careful of confirmation bias. It doesn't mean things aren't tricky and the culture isn't a little bit against us, but let's just make sure we keep it balanced. The second thing is that this is not a new experience, and I alluded to this when I questioned the 1994 kind of marker. While the cultural era we're living in may be unique, and in many ways, and the change has been rapid, those who put their faith in God have experienced this sort of thing for thousands of years. Now let me take you back to the psalm. Listen again to the lament of the psalmist, and I've got I don't know if it's an issue or an admiration for David here, but here's some of the words. "When I humbled my soul with fasting, they insulted me for doing so. When I made sackcloth my clothing, I became a byword to them. I am the subject of gossip for those who sit at the gates, and the drunkards make songs about me." Hasn't changed much. Thousands of years. So it's not a new thing, which means that we've got some good, helpful guide as to how we should respond. So let's have a look. Let's look at 3 possible postures, 3 possible actions for Christians living in the secular world. And I've been a good preacher, and I've given them 3 words, each of them starting with C. So that's all you need to remember for the sermon, really. And our first one, you can see I was stretching to get the C words to all line up. The first one is the posture of cloistering. I think our next slide will summarise that. There we go. This is driven by fear, and we all feel it occasionally. It's that feeling of being overwhelmed by an increasingly complex and often hostile world. And then the desire that comes from that to retreat into the familiar, the safe, the easy, to cloister ourselves away with people who think like us, or to simply retreat into frivolous entertainment that doesn't need us to think at all. We're very tempted, and we feel much safer if we hide away and lock ourselves away in safe spaces. Now, the irony is that the very culture that provokes our fear also promotes our unhelpful response. Mark Sayers, another cultural commentator, writes this way: "The whole of contemporary Western culture, from the structure of our malls and cities to the very fabric of the internet and social media platforms, are ideologies that shape us towards a vision not rooted in the eternal, but in the unlimited freedom and pleasure of the individual." You can hear the fear even in the psalmist's cry. "But as for me, my prayer is to you, O Lord, at an acceptable time, O God." I've never prayed, this is my issue with David, or my admiration. I don't think I've ever prayed in a time of trouble, "At an acceptable time to you, O God, in the abundance of your steadfast love." Now, help me now. But anyway, that's a side note. He says, at an acceptable time, in the abundance of your steadfast love, answer me. With your faithful help, rescue me from the sinking in the mire. Let me be delivered from my enemies, from the deep waters. Do not let the flood sweep over me, or the deep swallow me up, or the pit close its mouth over me. Of course, sometimes we feel fearful. We feel the desire to be safe, to be protected. And it's easy to succumb to fear and the desire to cloister ourselves away. But I want to suggest that that is not the response Jesus calls us to. So what's the other option? Well, then there's the other C word, combat. This is a good one. This feels good. See, let me read to you, and I need to be careful with this, but let me read to you from the website of a very well-respected non-denominational Christian youth organisation. And they say this, if you look up on their website, a spiritual battle rages for the hearts and minds of our youth. Scripture warns us that the enemy comes to steal, kill and destroy, and that is exactly what has been happening to the young people in our nation who have been taken out by suicide, anxiety, porn addiction, brokenness, meaninglessness and confusion. It's war. This year we launched a bold strategic battle plan to spread the gospel to young people across the entire nation. Now, I don't want to be too critical of this or similar organisations. They do lots of great work, and I don't actually disagree with most of their concerns. What I struggle with is the posture, the aggressive, warlike language. I'd make a similar criticism of groups like the Australian Christian Lobby. If fear is the flight response, then this is the fight response. When things are hard, and we're kind of stressed out, we either fear, we hide, we cloister away, or we fight. And it feels good to take a stand, to fight back against evil, or even better, to cheer someone else on who's doing it for us. It feels kind of good. And we can even justify it biblically. And you might not have picked it up, but it's in the Psalm today. After Jesus clears the temple, gets the whip out and clears the temple, the disciples remember the line that we heard this morning from Psalm 69. It is zeal for your house that has consumed me. It's right there. So surely if Jesus can take a whip to the temple market stalls, then we can mount a fight against the cultural wars of our day. But this is not the response that Jesus calls us to either. I'll explain why in a little bit. Side note, again, social media is not the source of all evil, but it does, interestingly, drive us into exactly both of those two options. Its algorithms herd us into little cloisters of like-minded people and then whip us up into a battle frenzy of aggression against everyone else. It's kind of the way they're designed to work. If you've ever, and beware of doom scrolling, and doom scrolling can lead you down two paths. I know because I've been down both of them, and it's not helpful. But if the fear doom scrolling is where you find all the bad news and you just keep looking on your feeds and stopping to read all the things that make you go, oh, that's terrible. And then you read it, and then you're more depressed. Then you read something else and go, oh, my goodness, that's terrible. I'm going to read that. And then you're looking around, oh, my goodness, I'm going to read that. And you make yourself more and more miserable. Or you can go the other way, and I've been down this path, and you flick through into it, and you go, I can't believe they're saying that. I'm going to read that one. And then you go, and then you read the comments. Oh, goodness me, that gets you started. And there we are in either cloistering or combat mode. And that's not what we're called to. So what are we called to? We need some good news. Let's have a quick look at the reading from Matthew. I'm going to sort of pick bits. There's so much in that reading. I'm going to pick some bits out and see what clues it gives us. Because in this reading, Jesus sends out his disciples into the surrounding towns. And he sends them out not in fear and not to do battle, but to show compassion. There's our third one. And we're going to sit on that slide for probably the rest of it now. So he sends them out. Listen to what they're sent to do. Now, this was just the bit before where our reading started, so it's important to get this for context. These 12, Jesus sent out with the following instructions. Go nowhere among the Gentiles and enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Now, that's interesting in itself as to who he sent them to. But listen to this. As you go, proclaim the good news. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons. You received without payment, give without payment. Jesus sends out his followers to bring hope and to show compassion, which should come as no surprise to us because that's exactly what Jesus himself has been doing in the lead up to this moment. And if you flick back, you even just flick back in your Bibles to the headings of the chapters that are thrown in there helpfully for us. Jesus has just spent his time healing and bringing hope. He doesn't send them out to reclaim cultural influence or power. He doesn't send them out to protest for more rights or to campaign for more freedoms. He sends them out to heal, to comfort, and to encourage, to show compassion. Now, Jesus knew his disciples would be prone to reacting in fear, just as we're tempted to do sometimes. And if you read on past where our reading stopped, he actually addresses that. One of the most repeated commands in the Bible is fear not. Some commentators like to suggest that it's commanded 365 times. Everyone argues about exactly the number, but it's fun to say there's one for every day of the year. Fear not. And why? Why does it say it so often? Because God understands that we're prone to fear. And why shouldn't we fear? Because the command to fear not is most often followed by the reminder, because I am with you. Now skip a bit in the Matthew's Gospel, in the Matthew reading, where he sent them out and he suggested that they will run into trouble. They will end up getting arrested, dragged before councils. And he says this, when they hand you over, do not worry about how you are to speak or what you are to say, for what you are to say will be given to you at that time, for it is not you who speak, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. Don't be afraid, because I'll be with you. It's not saying it's not going to get tricky. It's saying don't be afraid. So we don't need to be fearful, and we don't need to be combative. We've suggested that Jesus drove out the temple stalls and all of that. Now, an exploration of Jesus clearing the temple will have to wait for another day, but suffice it to say that using it as a justification for aggression by Christians is the worst sort of proof texting. As a simple counter, this is the same Jesus that told us to turn the other cheek. Listen to how he sends out the disciples. Again, back to Matthew. It says, see, I am sending you out like sheep in the midst of wolves. If I was sending an army into combat, I would not send sheep into a bunch of wolves. That doesn't say combat to me. I'm sending you out like sheep in the midst of wolves, so be as wise as serpents and innocent as doves. We don't have to go out and win back Christendom. We're less the soldiers at war and more the medical personnel running bravely into enemy fire to bring hope and healing to the wounded. That's the Christian's role in society. And there's, just as I finish up, there's a really encouraging kind of perspective to this that takes some of that pressure off. Because when we think about trying to win back Christendom and we want our cultural power back again, that forces us into that fear or the anger kind of mode. But when we take a broader view, actually, in a weird way, the pressure's off. Mark Sayers, again, puts it this way. Christians need to realise there's an element where during Christendom we had the ball and the ball was moving culture to a future flourishing. Secularism is taking the ball off us, and many people lament that. But the positive side of that is like, okay, you go guys, create your utopia, let's see how you go with that. Because what we find is that the cracks are already starting to show and people are crying out for help. And we have a message of hope and we have compassion to bring into that. So whatever town or village you enter, find out who in it is worthy and stay there until you leave. As you enter the house, greet it. If the house is worthy, let your peace come upon it. If it's not worthy, let your peace return to you. If anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, shake off the dust from your feet as you leave that house or town. It's good advice for anyone on social media too. If someone didn't like what you posted, shake the dust off your feet, close the tab and walk away. It's helpful, I think. but it's a good model for how we engage with society. We're called to engage with compassion. Let me leave you with a final word from Steve McAlpine. We started with the start of the book, we'll jump to the end, because I think he sums it up nicely. He says this: "We worship a God who delights in reversing roles, lifting up the humble and bringing down the proud, filling the empty and sending the full away empty-handed. We look to the God who will one day welcome us with love and joy. We wait for the day when he will say to those whom the world said were the bad guys, 'Well done, good and faithful servants.'" And that's a good ending. I hope that's been encouraging for you.